Posso chiedermi se qualcuno di voi preferisce non essere registrato durante la presentazione o posso mettere tranquillamente in pausa la registrazione nel caso? Va bene, okay.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the parallel session of Room C. As you know, we have a very rich and tight schedule, so let's get started. Since we are in time, every speaker will have about 12 minutes, and a general discussion will follow at the end of the 3 presentations. The first talk is by Gustavo Cevolani and Davide Coraci, IMT School for Advanced Studies, Lucca, Italy. The title of their talk is Reverse Inference and Bayesian Confirmation in Cognitive Neuroscience. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, good evening. I will share the screen. Okay. Hope that you can hear me and see the slides. Yep. Okay, I hope that the presentation will last 12 minutes. This talk I will discuss the problem of reverse inference in cognitive neuroscience, where reverse inference is say a widely used and accepted inferential strategy for assessing the relationship between cognitive process and, in particular in fMRI studies, cognitive process and activation of brain regions. And in order to, sorry, oh, okay, 1 year of online meetings and still having problems with. Okay, in order to understand the structure of reverse inference, we briefly introduce, let's say, from a logical point of view, this type of inference. Then we'll move to the, I would say, the main approach in the literature, that is the Bayesian analysis of this type of reasoning, and start, let's say, discussing some issues related to this approach and problems that may arise with this Bayesian analysis, task relativization and the so-called plurality of confirmation measures. According to Poldrack, the reverse inference can be understood as, let's say, a fallacious reasoning based on the 2 premises P1 and P2 that you can read here on the slide, and trying to draw in, let's say, this conclusion about the engagement of a certain cognitive process given the activation in our fMRI study of a brain pattern. This type of reasoning is follows a well-known form of fallacy, that is the fallacy of affirming the consequent, and can even be, say, understood and formalized as a form of abduction, that is an inference from evidence from our activations of brain patterns to their best explanation, what is, let's say, supposed to cause this observation, this evidence, for instance, the engagement of a certain cognitive process. And a well-known still problems. Okay. Okay, sorry. A well-known example of reverse inference is the, say, argument underlying Greeny's publication 2001, in which participants were presented with different types of moral dilemmas and were asked to judge, say, as adequate or not a certain behavior. Then Greeny's and collaborators, I mean, the reverse inference here works as follows. They, in line of according to the engagement of the certain region, the region that they listed during this fMRI acquisition, and knowing that certain, let's say, regions from the literature are more related to cognitive or emotion-based processes, they try to infer the engagement of what cognitive process is engaged according to the specific moral dilemmas that was presented, even supporting certain moral philosophical, let's say, theories about, such as deontology and utilitarianism, about how we should behave in a specific context. Why this is a form of a fallacious reasoning and can be considered as a reverse inference, the main problem is the so-called lack of selectivity of brain region. That is, many different cognitive processes may cause the activation of the same areas act, what we call here act, and when we reverse infer with our fMRI results, let's say, when we reverse infer from the activation to the engagement of a certain cognitive process, for instance, cognitive process COG1, we cannot be completely sure that COG1 is actually what caused the activation of what we observe, let's say, in our experiment. So in order to face this problem and in general model the reverse inference, there are many proposals in the literature, and we will now start discussing I would say, the main approach, the Bayesian approach to reverse inference that understood this reasoning, and in particular the relationship between the cognitive process and the activation we can observe as the posterior probability P of COG given the activation. That is the conditional probability of the engagement of that process given the observation, eventually even considering, let's say, the specific task comparison. We'll see later more in detail this aspect. As all Bayesian analysis, of course, we have to apply the Bayes rule, and in order to do that, then in order to calculate our posterior, we have to know the likelihoods related to the process and the absence, let's say, of this process and the priors of COG and its complement. We'll not enter in detail because of the problem of time, let's say, and but in general, when we end up in the end, when we have our posterior probability, we can, to some extent, let's say, assess the role of the activation of the brain region that is activated and in supporting a certain cognitive hypothesis. Suppose that what we call here act is your activation favors and suppose still that you have two different competing cognitive hypotheses, COG1 and COG2. Act favors, for instance, COG1 under a specific task condition, even though if by comparing the two posteriors, we have that we have that the posterior calculated for the first hypothesis is higher than the posterior calculated for the second one. However, in parallel to this tool, let's say, the Bayes rule, even the Bayes factor was introduced for modeling reverse inference and assessing, let's say, the strength, the force of the evidence in supporting a certain hypothesis. The Bayes factor is is defined as the ratio between the odds, two odds that are the odds of the posterior and the odds of the prior, where the odds in turns are the ratios between, for instance, the prior odds is the ratio between the prior related to the cognitive process and its complement, and the posterior is the ratio between the posterior of cog and its complement. However, we have again another measure, say, for assessing the role of the activation in supporting a certain hypothesis, and we can conclude in general that an activation favors, for instance, cognitive process 1 when if and only if, sorry, no more the posteriors here, but the bias factor calculated for the first hypothesis is higher than the bias factor for the other hypothesis, the competing one. So we have seen two different tools, but say by introducing the bias factor, we have actually introduced even a conceptual distinction, a theoretical distinction between the notion of probability and the notion of confirmation, because the bias factor is in the Bayesian analysis, in the Bayesian framework, let's say, is considered as a measure of confirmation, and confirmation is not equivalent to posterior to the probability, in particular posterior probability. Indeed, the confirmation is understood, is considered as an increase in probability. A certain evidence is said to confirm a certain hypothesis if and only, let's say, when the posterior, the probability of the engagement of a certain process, given the evidence, given the observation act, is higher than the probability, sorry, of the same hypothesis without the evidence, without the observation. So when the posterior, say, increases compared to the prior. As said before, the confirmation is not an hypothesis probability. Indeed, we can define two different ways in which a certain evidence gave evidential support, even evidential support for certain functions, the engagement of certain functions, certain cognitive hypotheses. And according to firmness, according to the first, let's say, notion we have seen, that is the probability, act favors cog1 if and only if the posterior calculated for that hypothesis is higher. But if we assume the bias factor as a relevant tool for modeling reverse inference, we are actually considering the increase in firmness as a concept of evidential favoring, and we have seen that act favors cognitive process 1, if and only if a specific confirmation measure, such as the bias factor, is higher. And actually, we can have that. The question is, the more relevant aspect is we can have an high posterior probability without incremental confirmation, and the other way around, we can have a low posterior probability but still confirmation. And this aspect that has been, say, quite overlooked in the literature so far is relevant, at least when the Bayesian approach is followed. Then another, we'll try to say something about the consequence of assuming a Bayesian approach for modeling reverse inference, and in light of some proposals in the literature. The first proposal is to use task-related for increase the selectivity of brain region. As said at the beginning, we have this problem that is many cognitive processes may engage the same region. When we make our reverse inference, then there is a problem of selecting the right cause of this activation. Then there is this proposal, according to Atzer, that is to use task relativization. What is task relativization? Say that the idea is that under specific tasks, it's more likely that certain cognitive processes are investigated, are engaged under specific tasks rather than other tasks. So when we run our bias rule, our Bayesian analysis for estimating the role of the activation in supporting a certain hypothesis, we should consider even the task. Okay, but Atzer's proposal is to use task-related likelihoods. So task relativization should not affect the priors that are set at 0.5 at the chance level. If we follow this proposal, then the distinction we have made before between firmness and increase of firmness, between the notion of probability, the role of probability, posterior probability, and the role of confirmation, such as the Bayes factor, let's say, collapses, because these two notions, these two concepts, let's say, work in parallel. That is, we have an higher posterior if and only if we have an higher bias factor, let's say, for the same hypothesis, for the same cognitive process. Then there is, let's say, an alternative to use even task-related priors for assessing the cognitive process. That is, we consider the task relativization as something that, as a tool that affects even the probability of cog given the task. But then another problem, another issue arises, that is the problem of measure sensitivity. The fact that the bias factor is just one confirmation measure among others, and the fact that it has been introduced as a tool for assessing the reverse inference is, I mean, is to some extent a problem, because we can consider even other confirmation measure as, say, conceptually, theoretically equivalent for assessing the role of the activation in supporting a certain hypothesis. Indeed, we can, for instance, consider a difference measure or a ratio measure. But even if all these confirmation measures will be considered as theoretically equivalent for assessing the role of the activation in supporting and in confirming a certain hypothesis, they are, say, not to be ordinally equivalent. That is, according to one confirmation measure, it could happen that is the cognitive process 1, for instance, first hypothesis, that is the most confirmed, but according to another confirmation measure is the other competing hypothesis the most confirmed. So
sorry, you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, perfect, because it's the, yeah, I have just one other slide. It becomes relevant to understand in light of even to the neuroscientific actual practice, to understand which is the best way for modeling this confirmatory rule of reverse inference. And then in conclusion, we have seen the Bayesian analysis, that is the main approach for modeling reverse inference. But even if this is the, let's say, most accepted way of modeling reverse inference, even in this case, we have some issues, some open questions that should be faced, should be taken into account. We have seen that the distinction between probability and confirmation, if we are, let's say, taking the reverse inference as a confirmatory tool with a confirmatory role, and let's say, another aspect, another issue could be to assess the role of task relativization for increasing the selectivity of brain region. And probably we will see later in the next talk the fact that reverse inference can have not only can have a confirmatory role, but even another role for, let's say, for cognitive neuroscience. And thank you for your attention. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Coraci. Thank you for your insightful talk. Now, the second talk is by Francesco Calzavarini, University of Bergamo, Gustavo Cevolani, IMT Lucca, and Marco Viola, University of Turin. The title of their talk is Abductive Reasoning in Cognitive Neuroscience, Weak and Strong Reverse Inference. And please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me and see the screen.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so good evening. I'm Gustavo Cevolani, and this is joint work with Fabrizio Calzavarini and Marco Viola. Actually, Fabrizio is the main author on this paper. I should have been the presenter, but he had the last minute problem, so he's sorry not to being here. Let me also mention one thing. This talk is going to be similar to the one David already presented, and this is good because so I can save time on many things that David has already said. This is not, since we are in a neuroethics conference, this is not a talk on properly on neuroethics, okay? It is on the methodology of cognitive neuroscience in general, okay? It is about some fundamental questions about inference cognitive neuroscience. Of course, it applies to neuroethics a fortiori, let's say. Okay, so what we are going to do is basically the following. The idea is that reverse inference, which is a widely, as Davide told us, it is a widely used strategy in cognitive neuroscience and in neuroethics in particular, can be construed, can be regarded from a philosophical point of view as a kind of abductive reasoning. Okay, this is quite well understood. Poldrack himself recognized this, so it's okay. As such, it has been strongly criticized in the last 20 years within the neuroscientific community. Okay, to the point that today many, or at least some neuroscientists say, okay, this is basically a fallacy, we should not use it, it is dangerous, better to get rid of reverse inference and so forth. There is quite a heated debate between the supporters of reverse inference and the critics of reverse inference. Now, our claim is quite modest, and it is that there is a distinction in the philosophical discussion about abductive reasoning between two kinds, two roles, two functions that abductive reasoning can play: a weak and a strong one, a strategic or heuristic one, and a justificatory one. And paying attention to this distinction in the context of cognitive neuroscience can help making clear what the debate is about. In short, the take-home message will be that while criticizing critiques to what we call strong reverse inference, or reverse inference contra strong abductive reasoning, are basically sound, okay, you can still defend reverse inference as a weak inferential strategy. Okay, now the bulk of the paper is the discussion of three main case studies that I will skip completely for in the interest of time, and also because Fabrizio is the real expert on the neuroscientific part, so I wouldn't be able to do this, but it is okay because we wouldn't have time. Okay, so let me briefly explain what abduction is. Abduction is a type of inference that is frequently employed both in everyday and scientific reasoning, and it basically means reasoning backwards from effects to possible causes, from effects or phenomena to possible explanations, and so on and so forth. A typical example is medical diagnosis. Okay, when you go to the doctor with your symptoms, the doctor has to guess what illness you have on the basis of these symptoms. So what he does is coming up with an hypothesis that can explain the symptoms. And of course, you have to select the best hypothesis, let's say. Okay. Now, abduction has been very much studied within the philosophy of science. There is basically, the debate is still open. There is basically no consensus on neither on the actual importance of abduction, its relation with induction, which is a different kind of inference. And so there is still much debate, but I will focus only on one distinction, which is pretty clear, that abductive reasoning can have two different functions, okay? One is what we call the strategic or heuristic role, or weak role, okay? Where the main function of abduction is generating new explanatory hypotheses and assisting discovery, okay? The second one is the strong or justificatory role of abduction, which has to do with assessing and possibly accepting selected hypotheses, which is much stronger, of course, okay? Now, much of the discussion has mostly focused on this last strong way of looking at abduction, okay? Both in philosophy and in neuroscience, but we think that keeping in mind this distinction is quite important. Now, strong abduction is basically what I said before. A classical example in neuroethics is the study of Bagrini and co-authors already quoted by Davide, where basically the idea is the following: I have two different views of moral reasoning, two different hypotheses of moral reasonings. I have participants performing some task of assessing different actions, behavior, morally right, morally wrong, morally permissible, morally impermissible, and so on and so forth. And they are doing this task within an fMRI machine, okay? Then I observe brain activations, okay? And I come up with an hypothesis. In particular, I observe a difference in brain activation in different tasks, okay? And I come up with a hypothesis according to which participants performing a task, what Green is called personal task, have brain areas connected to emotion highly activated or more activated than participants not dealing with this task. And the conclusion is that moral reasoning in these cases is not driven by reasoning itself, but mostly by emotions and intuition. This is the basic idea. This is a very strong form of abductive reasoning. It is a reasoning backward from effects to causes, and it is quite doubtful that it can be accepted as such. Okay, and the Green studies has been criticized also on these grounds. Then philosophers disagree, as I just said. On there have been also philosophical critiques to this kind of strong abduction, basically because it is not easy at all to understand what the best explanation is, whether we should expect the best explanation, even if this is the best of a bad lot, so it is not so good after all. And it is not also clear whether abductive reasoning is compatible with standard Bayesian confirmation theory, which is quite standard in philosophy of science. Okay, so these are some reasons to look more precisely to weak abduction, okay, which has to do, as we said, not with accepting or justifying one explanation, but basically with coming up with different plausible hypotheses, then you can need to test with different means, with different methods. Okay, the idea is just to discover or create a new possible explanation of the evidence. Okay, there are a couple of contributions. These Gerhard Schurz recently has a nice survey view of this weak role of abduction, and as he says, the crucial function of this pattern of abduction is using it as a search strategy, which leads us for a given kind of scenario in a reasonable time to a most promising explanatory connection that then is subject to further test. Okay, we don't accept the conclusion of abductive reasoning by itself. Lorenzo Magnani is another author working on abduction, and he distinguishes between selective and creative abduction. Okay, one thing is to select an hypothesis for further testing among a possible pool of hypotheses. Another one is coming up with a really new hypothesis, okay, as an explanation of the facts. As all these things will play a role in others. So the basic idea, our starting point is simply that if you blur the distinction between weak and strong abduction, we are going to lose something in understanding the notion. Okay, you should keep in mind this. And whereas philosophers have in mind more or less this distinction, usually neuroscientists, also those interested in methodology, don't have these distinction in mind. And the goal, very modest goal of the paper, is exactly to explain what this distinction is and how it applies to the context of cognitive neuroscience. So this is something David already presented. Basically, in cognitive neuroscience, as I said before, you perform reverse inferences of abductive reasoning from patterns of brain activation to the engagement of putative cognitive processes. Okay, and this is of course a certain inference. Podrak himself recognized in his pioneer paper that it is a form of abductive inference, as Peirce called it. And but the entire discussion has been basically, most of the discussion has been, okay, reverse inference is not a valid piece of reasoning, so how we can improve it in order to make it good for accepting justifying cognitive hypotheses about cognitive processes. Okay, And one influential proposal has been to use data mining and machine learning techniques to make reverse inference more robust. Okay, there are these platforms, Neuroscience, BrainMap, and many others, which are basically huge databases of neuroscientific studies, and you can extract from them the statistical relation between cognitive processes and the brain activation very shortly. Okay. And there has been a huge discussion here with people using these systems for not in a proper way, let's say, but I have to skip these. From a more theoretical point of view, as David has said, there was this attempt to understand the reverse inference in Bayesian terms. I will not go into the detail. And you can mix these two approaches, and you can use Neuroscience, for instance, to perform Bayesian inference, Bayesian reverse inference, basically in an automatic fashion. Okay, you can select the cognitive process with higher posterior probability using these databases. But in the end, this is Tali Arconi, the creator of Neuroscience, so it is quite an authoritative voice. It says, okay, you cannot do what we call strong reverse inference in Neuroscience. Okay, so there was a heated debate that I have to skip. But the idea is that still you cannot do strong reverse inference with this kind of approach. So there are reasons to look at the prospect for weak reverse inference understood as weak abductive reasoning. And indeed, in the paper, we discuss 3 case studies where this is actually performed very clearly from working neuroscientists. I will skip the detail, but let me give you the basic idea. Here, as I said, you can use all the methodologies or the techniques that neuroscientists use, but the idea is that you don't come up with a cognitive hypothesis you can just accept, but it is just to put it to further test. Okay, it is so in this way it can be defended. Basically, Podrak himself again noted this possible role for weak reverse inference, means to generate novel hypotheses, and this is repeated in recent discussion, for instance, by Torweger, that it says you can use neuroscience and related stuff in order to get a rough idea of what a brain map is, but you cannot just use it to accept hypotheses. So let me just mention these 3 case studies. One first idea is that is basically selective abduction in the Magnani's terminology. The idea is that you start with a couple of possible hypotheses, okay, which could be about cognitive processes that could be engaged in the task, in the relevant task. You observe the brain activation, and by doing this, you select a subset or possible one of these competing hypotheses.
Sorry, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm finishing. And you try to select the most worthy one for further experimental investigation. This is one possible way to go. The second one is creative abduction in a weak sense, meaning that, of course, within the databases, all the possible hypotheses are already there. You cannot have machine learning suggesting really new hypotheses, okay? So still, however, what you can find are statistically relevant regularities which in the past went unnoticed, okay? And these can lead you to new theoretical model and new theoretical concept in order to interpret these patterns of regularities at the level of the brain activation. Okay, it's all very abstract, but unfortunately I cannot discuss the details of the case studies. And finally, actually, you can claim, at least some neuroscience claim, that you can use these techniques, weak reverse inference, in order to do really creative abduction. Okay, sometimes they look at the data and they come out with a very new hypothesis, for instance, a new psychological process. which is going to change the cognitive, our cognitive ontology, so-called cognitive ontology. Okay, so this is one of the examples where we discuss, but I will skip the detail. Okay, so basically the conclusion is that whereas critiques against a strong reverse inference contra strong justificatory abductive reasoning are basically right in our view, you can still defend reverse inference as a form of weak abduction in at least these three cases, okay? And yeah, basically this is the conclusion. This can help both philosophers to understand what is going on in the cognitive neuroscience community, and within neuroscientists themselves, in order to make sense of what they use and the limits and capabilities of their methods and techniques and instruments. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Cevolani, for your talk. And now we have our third presentation by Roberto Fumagalli, King's College London. The title of his talk is A Reformed Division of Labor for the Science of Well-Being. Please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me and see the slides, actually? Very good. So good evening to you all, and welcome and thanks for being here together, albeit virtually. So over the last couple of decades, much theoretical and empirical work across both philosophy and the empirical sciences has been devoted to the definition and the measurement of well-being. Unfortunately, a lot of disagreements remain regarding both the definition and the measurement of well-being. And in particular, when we focus on the contemporary literature, we see the three main positions about what role exactly philosophical theories and empirical findings should respectively play in the science of well-being have been proposed. Now, these three main positions are theory-based approaches, evidence-based approaches, and coherentist approaches. What I would like to do in this brief presentation is to briefly outline the main tenets of each of these three main approaches and the major challenges faced by them. And then in the time I will have left, I will briefly expand on and I will argue that a revised version of theory-based approaches, which I call Reformed Division of Labor for the Science of Well-being, can actually address all the major challenges faced by theory-based approaches while retaining the main tenets of theory-based approaches. So in a sense, is a vindication, is an upgraded version of TDAs against alternative approaches. Now, to be clear about what I'm actually claiming, my result does not actually exclude that evidence-based approaches or coherentist approaches may be improved or amended in the years to come. However, I take it that together with the major challenges that actually face these approaches, it shifts the burden of justification on the proponents of these particular approaches. Now, enough for a stage setting, I think. So let's dive directly into the first of these approaches. So theory-based approaches prescribe a sharp division of labor in the science of well-being, whereby philosophers on the one hand provide general theories of well-being, and on the other hand, empirical scientists provide actually measures that are actually grounded on the philosopher's theories. On these theory-based approaches, philosophers should identify which goods and experiences exactly enhance individuals' well-being. And after philosophers have done their work, so to speak, the scientists enter the stage and they should try to specify exactly what sort of factors are causally and or statistically related to the goods and experiences identified by the philosophers. And the idea is that the best theory in this kind of perspective is the one that is most faithful to what we think, we feel, or we know about individuals' well-being. Now, as you can guess, these theory-based approaches are especially prominent about philosophers. Now, in spite of their prominence, however, theory-based approaches face a number of challenges, and I will briefly expand on three challenges in turn, with the help of my colors, actually. The first challenge is the challenge from theoretical disagreement, and the idea simply is that for decades or even centuries, philosophers just have failed to agree about what exactly well-being consists in and which goods and experiences enhance well-being. And if the science of well-being was held hostage to philosophers' disagreement, we will never get off the ground. So it's just the wrong place to start with. Second challenge is the challenge from limited measurability. And the idea is simply that to be an object of science, well-being needs at the very least to be measurable and measurable reliably. And unfortunately, theories of well-being, the ones developed by philosophers, are not sensitive to the measurability constraints that are so dear to the empirical scientists, as these compromises measurements and therefore undermines the prospects of the science of well-being. Third, we find the challenge from contextualism. And the idea simply stems from the fact that if we look at philosophical theories of well-being, they typically rely on all things considered evaluation of how people's lives overall go. Whereas on the other hand, when we look at the concrete empirical studies, these actually rely on highly specific, context-specific judgments. And this kind of approach, which is so productive, so the critics claim, in the empirical sciences, actually counsel us to relinquish completely the philosopher's grained aim to provide one single general theory of well-being. So not only they will be starting from the wrong place, they're actually aiming for the wrong target. So the critics go. Now, as a result of all the problems faced by theory-based approaches, different approaches have been developed. So in the minutes I've left, I will briefly expand on evidence-based approaches and coherentist approaches, and then move to my approach. So evidence-based approaches. The idea of these approaches is that the science of well-being should be grounded not so much on philosophical theories of well-being, but rather on direct empirical measures of well-being. And they should actually take as a prime objective the quantitative studies of the causal or statistical determinants of well-being. So on these kinds of approaches, empirical findings, and this is a crucial point, empirical findings provide a basis not only for measuring well-being, but also for defining what well-being actually consists in the first place. So the very foundation of the science of well-being should be evidence-based rather than theory-based. So the thought here is that we should aim to identify statistically significant correlations between putative measures of well-being, think of subjective well-being measures, and purported welfare-related factors such as money, health, you name what, and determine whether the proffered measures of well-being actually behave in accordance with the prediction of researchers about these very measures. So the idea is that we try to achieve, so to speak, construct validation of the constants we are actually using in this discipline. Unsurprisingly, these different approaches are highly prominent among the empirical sciences. However, as I'm going to expand in a second, also these approaches face really serious challenges. And again, I'll go with three, the magic number challenges for you. So the first challenge is a challenge from measurement divergences. And here the problem is that the measurements of well-being that we see in the empirical sciences can vary remarkably depending on what methods you use to actually measure well-being, and not just well-being in general, but even specific welfare constructs. So it's not just an issue deriving from the vagueness of our target construct, it's really an issue having to do with the divergences between the different methods. And by different methods, I mean, for instance, physiological measures versus subject own evaluation of their own hedonic experiences. And not only that, but even when we focus on the specific well-being constructs that are targeted by researchers, we see that actually that measurements vary remarkably depending on what kind of properties we ascribe to these particular constructs. For instance, they may depend hugely depending on whether we actually think of well-being as something that targets just individuals' feelings, or also individuals' attitudes regarding the feelings that they have. The second challenge is the challenge from uninformativeness. And here the thought is simply that some normative presupposition is required to establish which of the many and potentially uncountably many correlations actually track well-being rather than some other related construct. And the problem is that the construct validation schemes actually employed by the empirical scientists cannot by themselves, namely cannot without the help of theoretical assumption, establish the constructs are normatively valuable, namely that they have the normative significance that is required to substantiate the claims that are made in the name of this construct. Third and final challenge for this approach is the challenge of conceptual thickness. And here the thought is simply that when we focus on well-being, we see that well-being is a thick concept in the precise sense that when we ascribe well-being to some particular person, we are meaning that this person is having something that is worth having. So it's an inherently normative ascription that we are actually making. And as a result, showing that the measures which enhance particular indexes, empirical indexes, also enhance well-being, crucially requires us to specify how indexes actually map on well-being. And again, this actually requires theoretical presupposition, which is to say, evidence-based approaches, contrary to what the proponents claim, do not actually get off the ground without, contrary to what they claim, presupposing some theory of well-being, at least implicitly, at the very foundation of their approach. Let me move on, coherentist approaches. That's the third main alternative that we see. And these coherentist approaches try, so to speak, a Hegelian synthesis of the two approaches we have actually seen. And apologies for the reference to continental philosophy. So the thought here is that in the science of well-being, we should actually work both from the empirical base, from the empirical findings, from bottom up, so to speak, and top down, namely from the philosophical theories that the philosophers have been developing, and then synthesizing the two. So on these coherentist approaches, philosophy is neither in the driver's seat as the really theory-based approaches would like to see, nor is purely a passenger as the empirical scientists would have it. And the idea is that defining and measuring well-being are actually codependent and iterative tasks. And the science of well-being should be grounded on a reflective equilibrium between theories and findings. So we should continuously go back and forth between theories and findings. And unfortunately, I'm going to say that in spite of their alleged initial promise, also coherentist approaches face huge problems. And again, I'll mention three challenges for reflection. The first challenge is the challenge from underdetermination. And the point here is that there are multiple combinations of theories and findings that may be adopted, and different combinations of theories and findings actually support rather dissimilar definitions and measures of well-being. And the coherentist approaches here face severe underdetermination issues. Now, bear in mind the following, both theory-based and evidence-based approaches face some underdetermination issue at the level of theories and findings, but these underdetermination problems combined, and so I argue in previous work of mine, generate severe underdetermination issues when we try to provide some coherentist measures that are based themselves on underdetermined theories and underdetermined findings. Second point, the challenge from disciplinary conflicts. And here the point is that even if we were able to solve somehow this underdetermination challenge, the problem is that the proponents of different disciplines are actually advocating rather dissimilar definition and measures. Nice analysis by Dan Hausman on the contrast, the sharp contrast between the measures and the definitions advocated by economists and the ones advocated by the psychologists. So even if, for the sake of argument, we were able to overcome underdetermination problems, where still huge kind of contrast will lie ahead. And finally, the challenge from theory indispensability. And here is a point I was having when critically reflecting on some of the so-called hard cases here, namely when trying to solve conflicts between theories and findings where really complicated cases arise. For instance, think of whether satisfying a morally questionable preferences enhance your well-being. What we see is that the proponents of coherentist approaches themselves don't actually solve this problem by combining theories and findings as their own kind of proposal would suggest, but they ultimately rely again on philosophical theories of well-being. So in a way, they're not even true to what they preach when we look carefully into their actual scientific practice. Now, in the few minutes I've left, I'll try to expand on my reform division of labor and see how far I can go with that. So my reform division of labor for the science of well-being agrees with theory-based approaches on two fundamental points. First, that the science of well-being should be grounded on philosophical theories of well-being rather than empirical findings or even a combination of findings and theories. And secondly, that what constructs and measures of well-being should actually be adopted crucially depends on what philosophical theories of well-being ultimately are correct rather than the findings that we have, at least primarily. Now, I want to emphasize, however, that I do agree with the proponents of evidence-based approaches and coherentist approaches that while the challenge faced by theory-based approaches are serious and they cast out on the proffered version of theory-based approaches. So to address the challenges, what I'm trying to do in this paper, and I'll be schematic in what follows, but I expanded length on it in the paper, I'm trying to modify the theory-based approaches in various respects so as to address the challenges they face while retaining the main tenets I mentioned of theory-based approaches. So I will telegraphically go over the three main challenges I mentioned at the very beginning and then conclude. So think back of the challenge from theoretical disagreement. Now, I agree with the proponents of evidence-based approaches and coherentist approaches that, as a matter of fact, philosophical theories of well-being frequently disagree on what kind of goods and experiences actually enhance people's well-being. However, my reply is that when we focus on the best available theories of well-being, namely on those theories of well-being that have survived all this crazy kind of back and forth that has been going among philosophers for decades, if not centuries, these theories, the surviving ones, are actually agreeing on what kind of goods and experiences tend to enhance well-being, at least in most situations. Think of most theories agreement on health, and occasionally also on under what condition the specific goods and experiences actually enhance well-being. Think of the endorsement requirement or the experience requirement in relation to health. Now, let me be clear here. This kind of agreement, contrary to what the proponent of traditional theory-based approaches advocate, does not enable us to get a single general theory of well-being. And the issue is easy to see, I think. The agreement often occurs only at a rather abstract level. So if all of us are actually agreeing that health enhances well-being, if you're actually advocating different conceptualization of health, our nominal agreement does not entail substantive agreement. However, as I try to explain at length in another piece of mine on paternalistic intervention, the agreement that there is among the best available philosophical theory at least constrains the set of plausible constructs and measures to an extent that is sufficient to get the science of well-being off the ground, so to speak. The final two challenges, and then I'm done. Challenge from limited measurability. Again, I agree with the critics of traditional theory-based approaches that researchers may justifiably discriminate between different constructs and measures in terms of the measurability of these measures. So measurability is a desideratum that we need to keep in mind in the science of well-being. However, contrary to both evidence-based approaches and contrary to coherentist approaches, this implies neither that empirical research is relevant to the defining well-being, nor that well-being has to be measurable if it's not initially. I mean, we might be unlucky and well-being is not measurable in the way they desire. That's a sad outcome, but it's not a reason, I think, to constrain well-being and to simplify its very definition to an extent that it doesn't support. And the reason is that what well-being consists in is not what kind of construct and measure are most conveniently adopted, and measurability by itself does not determine what kind of constructs are actually correct and what well-being consists in. Final challenge, and then final slide. The challenge from contextualism. Here, again, I want to grant to the critics of traditional theory-based approaches that different constructs and measures may suit really different purposes. So I'm open to having a multiplicity of theory of well-being in a pluralist fashion. However, I think that well-being itself does not have different definition of what kind of context we actually targeting. In fact, I think we can reconcile most of the putative variation in well-being definitions by simply reconciling them as being focusing on different aspects on a context invariant notion of well-being, and Guy Fletcher has done interesting studies on this issue already. And more specifically, I think that contextual notions of well-being don't exempt scientists from the need to actually come out with cross-contextual notion of well-being. I mean, how do we even start comparing different contextual notion of well-being without at least implicitly presupposing some cross-contextual notion of well-being is quite unclear to me. And finally, in the absence of really clear conditions for categorizing and demarcating different kind of context, I think that contextualism risks actually leading to an unruly proliferation of notions of well-being. So all in all, to recap, over the last couple of decades, theory-based, evidence-based, and coherentist approaches to the science of well-being have been advocated. These approaches have become highly influential in the literature, but as they stand, unfortunately, none of them provides a normatively, empirically adequate foundation for the science of well-being. I'm developing this reform division of labor, and I claim that it can address all the challenges faced by traditional theory-based approaches while remaining faithful to the main tenets of these particular approaches. This does not mean game over, does not exclude that evidence-based approaches and coherentist approaches may bite back, so to speak, but together with the challenges faced by these approaches, I really do think that it does shift the burden of justification once again back on the proponents of these approaches. Thank you so much for the attention, and I hope that I stayed just in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fumagalli, for your presentation. And now we have some minutes for Q&A. Any questions from the audience? You can ask it to all the three speakers.
Yes, if there are no questions from the audience, I just a little one for Roberto, if possible.
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Great talk. I completely ignorant about well-being and different measures and models, so this may be a naive question. This kind of work reminded me the classical traditional work on social choice theory, for instance. Okay, so the question is, are these measures of well-being supposed to measure the well-being of individuals or of groups of individual societies? And is there a way to go from assuming we have a good measure of the well-being of individuals, okay? Is there a sensible, meaningful way to say that the group of those individuals has such a degree of well-being, given those the individual degrees of well-being? Hope to it was clear.
Yes, thanks. Great question, Gustavo. I'm really delighted to see you, although at distance this time. A couple of replies, I think. Well, they are operating at both levels, I think. The ultimate aim, I think we can distinguish the proximate aims of the science of well-being and the ultimate aims, so to speak, or the more distal ones. The proximate one starts from individual studies where you can actually control what kind of factors may be impacting on people's perception of the situation they are in, the kind of evaluation they have from adaptation effect to other sorts of biases they might be having. But the ultimate aim is to actually climb the ladder and achieve policy recommendations. So this is definitely the ultimate aim they have. There are interesting complications, I would say, on both levels. On the one hand, I think already at the individual level, there are problems which to some people actually cast doubt already on the enterprise before actually generalizing at the aggregate level. But there are interesting ways, one might think, that we might be able to get aggregate results in spite of the problem faced by individual level studies, because, for instance, some kind of effect might cancel out in aggregation, or because of the fact we might be able actually to make reliable prediction on over large numbers, so to speak. So I think in that sense, it's a very interesting kind of question, the one you have, because it targets the level at which they are operating. The question I'm more engaging with this specific project is what kind of methods they should be using, no matter at what kind of level they are meant to operate. So in a way, they are orthogonal to each other. They cut across each other in many interesting ways, as I think. But thanks again for the nice question.
Thank you. Any other question? Robert, please.
Only if there are no questions from the public, I would say. So maybe I'll wait for a few more seconds and intervene later.
Please go ahead.
Okay, then it's a question for David, actually, and maybe for Gustavo as well, since you are engaged in the project together. So I was wondering, when we reflect about these reverse inferences, whether there are interesting respect to which the debate is contingent upon a couple of issues. One is the level of description of these cognitive processes, namely, are they mainly psychological level of descriptions? Are they neural? Are they neuropsychological? How do these authors actually distinguish between the two, if they do? And secondly, how finely grained is the description of these processes themselves? Because one and the same process can count as one and the same, or multiple instances of subtypes. And I was wondering whether people say something about this. And I ask this because I have a specific interest in the neuroeconomics debate. And there, for instance, people keep speaking of value-related activations, but they do not actually sufficiently often distinguish between exactly what kind of values are involved. And I think that's a serious problem for them. So have you been thinking about that and how that might ramify into your very interesting papers? Thank you.
Well, yeah, indeed, the main problem of reverse inference is, as we mentioned before, the selectivity of brain region. The other problem is the absence of taxonomy of cognitive process. Indeed, is the other question that is the so-called the cognitive ontology that we have, and in fact, the relationship between the different levels of description of cognitive process, if psychological, if neural, if mental, what I don't know what this means, but even mental phenomenon. This is an open debate that has been discussed even before the introduction of the topic of reverse inference by Poldrack, by Freestone and others authors. And I don't know if Gustavo would like to say something more, but this is yeah, is an open question. And it's quite difficult because different cognitive process may engage different regions and under different tasks, and it's a mess. It is the
Yes, basically I agree. Thanks, Roberto, for the questions. This is probably, as David said, the main point. Okay, it is related with the second part of your questions. Okay, on the first, I think there is a quite fair degree of agreement on what is cognitive, what is neural, let's say. But then the real problem is that on the cognitive side, here really the problem is big, because we lack, as far as I know, a proper cognitive ontology, proper classification, proper taxonomy. So as you say, what are value related areas? What does it mean value in our mind? Okay, so I mean, it is very difficult. Poldrack himself, he came a couple of years ago in Lucca. He was talking about the replicability crisis, but more or less the topic was similar, and he basically said we need the work by philosophers, by cognitive scientists, by neuroscientists in order to make progress on the cognitive ontology side, and only then we can hope for real progress in the empirical sciences. So yes, to young people attending these, I think this is a good thing to do. I mean, to look at. Thank you again for the question.
Thank you. Any other question? Just concerning what you just said, Gustavo, don't you think many neuroscientists are not so concerned about these issues? They don't think they needed to resort to other methodologies, and Poldrack is just a voice without many followers.
Difficult questions. Yes, of course, this is a problem with all the science, all the scientists, okay? That usually what a scientist does is to do experiments and to publish paper, and of course methodological issues are always on the background, okay? At best, during at home, during Sunday, you can think a little bit about methodological issues, but of course when he really works, he has to skip all this stuff, also because it is difficult, otherwise he wouldn't even start to work on what he needs to work on. I think that things are slightly changing. Poldrack is not alone, for instance, but yes, from a quantitative point of view, I can tell you whether, for sure it is not the majority. On this I agree with you. But I think that people in neuroeconomics, cognitive neuroscience, and so on are realizing that without some clear philosophical and methodological foundations, it is difficult to make real progress. But still, it is very hard to have collaborations and so on. So yes, I agree that it's an issue.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Okay, thank you very much to all the participants. We now are going to close this room, and we'll open the plenary session with Professor Nita Farahani in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.